when we're trying to change those neural pathways and make new changes, right, with anything in our life, particularly with trauma and changing relational patterns, right, that can be very challenging. And people tend to get very frustrated with themselves with the process because it feels like I'm not making any strides. And my favorite thing to do in sessions with clients is, well, remember when you first came, and taking them back to the beginning and reminding them of how they used to react to certain things. And then in that moment, they're like, oh yeah, I actually have grown. Right. And sometimes we need that person to remind us that, no, you're actually doing really great, and don't beat yourself up, and allow yourself to grieve as things come up.
Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be, into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hope Pedraza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to the show. I have on the show today Johanna Montenegro, and she is a licensed professional counselor serving Texas and is the owner of Whole Life Healing Therapy, where she is serving women through trauma counseling focused on relational trauma, including childhood abuse and neglect, spiritual trauma, and narcissistic abuse recovery. She's also the owner of the Mindful Collective Studio, where she provides integrative trauma-informed mindfulness practices, focusing on healing the mind, the body, and the heart. And today we are diving deep into kind of some trauma work, and specifically talking about spiritual trauma and relational trauma, and what that looks like, how it shows up in the body, and what it looks like in terms of the process of recovering from that, how we heal from this trauma, how we can grow and evolve as a human despite this trauma, and then how it shows up, because it looks different for everybody. She has such great insight on this. Love this conversation, because we all know mental health is health. Let's jump in. All right, y'all, let's jump in. I'm here with Johanna, and we are talking, let's see, I'm trying to figure out how to capture everything we're talking about, because there's a lot to this. We're talking mental health, we're talking trauma and trauma recovery, and all of those nice things that I think are really important to talk about right now. So Johanna is here to kind of give us insight on all of this, and kind of the whole holistic, mindful perspective on this. So thanks so much for joining me today, Johanna.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So why don't we just start? I'm going to start with you, just explaining who you are, what you do, to kind of give us some background on kind of where we're going today.
So my name is Johanna. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I serve Texas. And I am the owner of Whole Life Healing, which is my therapy practice. And I'm also the owner of the Mindful Collective, which is a mental wellness studio where we incorporate mindful movement, mindfulness practices, and mental health education to create a trauma-informed studio. Oh yeah, it's a little bit about me. I'm located in Fernie, Texas, but from San Antonio. I have 3 girls.
Love it. Yeah. That's perfect. I love it. Well, and I love the idea of Mindful Collective Studio. Like you were saying, it's this trauma-informed mindfulness practices. And we've talked a little bit on the podcast about trauma-informed movement, but you're doing so much more than just the movement piece, because you're informing people, you're educating people, you're tying so much into what that trauma-informed mindfulness is. So can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of what that all encompasses, talking about trauma-informed mindfulness practices?
Yeah. So with trauma-informed practices, just to give a little bit of a background, I am a therapist, but I specialize in relational trauma. So, childhood traumas, abuse, relationship traumas, anything that has to do with people hurting people, essentially. And in my work as a practitioner, I learned very quickly that talk therapy was only going to get people so far with healing their trauma. And so I kind of embarked on this journey of learning how to heal the mind and the body through the body, right? We experience trauma through our senses, so we have to process it out through our senses. And talk therapy is necessary, right? Because it helps us to give language to our experiences, but sometimes we don't have language to what happened.
Right.
And what I found was that our bodies were telling our bodies tell the story, right? They're screaming at us and telling us what's going on. But we have, historically just been taught to ignore or to put a Band-Aid over what's going on, right? And not really dig deep on what the root of the cause is, right. What's causing all of that stuff.
Right.
And so had the therapy practice and, realizing all of these new things, and really had just a passion to want to incorporate these things, but in a community setting, right? Where I can work individually one-on-one with a client, but that's not always accessible to people. And so my hope and heart was to create a space where we can have community education on all kinds of different mental health topics, but then help people practically implement how to heal their body through right? Like their mind and their heart and their body through mindful movement and mindfulness practices. And so as I kind of got into the spaces of different yoga studios and just learning more, I was like a fish out of water. I didn't know what I was getting into. I quickly learned that not all spaces are trauma informed.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? Not as far as, if you know what you're getting into, if you're going to go do a hot yoga class, like, that you're going in there and it's going to be intense, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
They all have a purpose, right? But for the person who is brand new to body awareness, right? And not knowing how to gauge that, it is really important for them to be in a space that really caters to choice and autonomy.
Yeah.
Right. And we heal in circles too. It's just, there's something that happens when you're in community with other people. And so implementing these different mindfulness practices of teaching people how to meditate, teaching people how to breathe, right? Trusting your body as you are gently moving through maybe different poses, or learning how to be comfortable just sitting and being and noticing each part of your body, right? We don't do that.
That's hard for people.
So hard.
It is. Well, and I love what you said about how we heal in circles. And by the time your episode comes out, this one will have already come out. But I have one coming out in a couple of weeks, and we weren't specifically talking about trauma, but we were talking about like vitality versus health versus vitality. And he was talking about this study that shows that when your body is in a state of stress or like, trauma, we're talking about trauma, that it releases oxytocin, which is like the cuddle hormone, right? So it's like God's way of being like, hey, you do need help. Like we are meant to like rally together and circle together. And I love that you said we heal in circles. Like we do need community and other people. And I know when people are going through trauma or they're dealing with trauma, like the last thing they want to do is be around other people or talk to other people. But I think the way that you're creating your space, people can come in and they can do these mindfulness practices, and they don't necessarily, like you say, they don't have to talk about it, but they're able to like move through it, right? I think there's power in that, not necessarily like sitting down and talking about your feelings all the time, but it's like letting this other part of you like help with the healing, like the body. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And then knowing that you're in a room with other people.
Exactly.
I remember my experience of my very early experiences with going into yoga studios. I was also in the middle of my own very traumatic and traumatizing time of life. And I remember going in and nobody knew what was going on in my life, right? Because it's not a space for that. But knowing that I wasn't alone, right? Just that, oh, okay, I'm with other people. There are other people here. They acknowledge my existence, right?
Exactly.
And I can leave all of the things that I came in with at the door and just be in peace. For a few moments, right?
Absolutely.
And that was so healing during that time. And so just wanting to create that same space.
Yeah,
for others.
I love that. What do you find? And I know it's going to be like individual depending on, what you're dealing with, but what do you find? Cause you have different modalities and stuff at this studio. What do you find is the most helpful type of movement for people? Like, is it the breath work? Is it the meditation? Is the actual movement through yoga? Like, what do you find, again, knowing that there's going to be some individuality, but what do you find that is the most helpful in terms of like helping with healing?
The most helpful and probably the most foundational and basic thing is learning how to breathe first.
Mm-hmm. I kind of thought you'd say that.
Yeah, it's the breath, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing with the breath is that for some people, it is triggering.
Yep.
You know, and we hear all the time, right? Like, go back to your breath, go back to your breath. Mm-hmm. But part of trauma sensitive mindfulness and mindfulness practices is that for some people, going to their breath or closing their eyes is very triggering.
Yep.
And so it's teaching how to guide people into learning that they're in a safe place, mm-hmm. right? That your breath helped you survive during probably a really not, a traumatic time.
Right.
And so shifting the mindset of it being triggering yep. to being something that creates safety, right? But in general, that is the one place that...
Yeah. And I think we could all use help in that area. Like I say, mm-hmm. I mean, I don't do the work you do as, being trauma informed and a therapist and all that, but I'm doing my teacher training for Pilates. I'm always saying that like people literally don't know how to breathe. Like you have to remind people to breathe. They really don't know how to breathe.
Yeah. And there's the deep breathing, which we don't practice, and this shallow breathing that's up in your chest and you think you're breathing and you're just like,
exactly. You're just giving yourself a panic attack. Yes. It's exactly
so it's really slowing it down and just noticing each inhale and exhale and noticing how it feels in your nostrils, right? Notice how it feels coming out through your mouth, right?
Bringing that mindfulness touch to the breathing itself, that like intentionality. And I think that's so crucial for people. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I find this really interesting, because I know you talk about this in terms of like what you do, is spiritual abuse recovery. And I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about that, because I know you do a lot with like relationship, child, like that kind of thing, but specifically talking about spiritual abuse recovery. What does that look like?
Yeah. So I find is a little bit newer space for people, right? And so as people are sharing more of their stories and their experiences with religious abuse and traumas, mental health professionals and other helping professionals are starting to realize that this is a space that needs to be addressed. And it's very different, I think, from relational, right? Like maybe a parent and child, even if the abuse, right, came from a parent or some kind of adult, is because that type of abuse is connected to a higher power, right? And so when we are hearing or being, abused, whether it's mentally, emotionally, physically, by someone who is using their higher power as the source of like, this is why I'm abusing you because God said, or that creates a whole other dynamic to the healing process. And it is very much, I have found, it's grieving, right? Like all trauma is a grieving process, but with it's for many people, it's attached to their identity too, right? And so there is a lot of confusion when you realize, that was an abusive situation, whether it was one time or prolonged, and undoing the beliefs and the mentalities that were shared during that time, right? In that experience. And everyone's experience and journey through spiritual trauma is totally different, and I think where I particularly land is with my clients, at least, and the people who are coming to me for help, is that they have this held identity, right, within them of, I believe this thing, but I've been hurt by this thing and I don't know where I stand with all of it, right?
Yep.
And so there's just a lot of untangling that has to be done in that process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about people's religious or spiritual beliefs, like those are like hardwired, like a lot of times, many times, most of the time, I think. And so you're literally having to rewire, because most of the time, if that's something, I'm assuming this, if that's something that people are recovering from, like that's something that's been since childhood, right? Like you were raised in a specific religious group or church or whatever. So that's like, since you were a child or a baby, like all of these things have been hardwired. So, you're literally having to rewire somebody's brain, right? When they're dealing with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of grace that has to be given
Yeah.
during that time, because there are moments of where I've seen, right, these moments of disbelief and wanting to like completely abandon, and then kind of roller coastering through all of these different
Yes.
emotions and thoughts of like, who am I
Mm-hmm.
without this?
Having to rediscover themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think what has been probably a big conversation lately is, like deconstructing, right? We're all taking it apart and picking it apart. But a conversation that also is, I think, probably slowly happening, at least in my therapy office, is the reconstructing, right? So we can pick this apart all day long, right? But what does it look like to bring the pieces together that are healthy,
Yep.
that I want to keep?
Right.
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 And for some people, it's, I'm going to just chunk this whole thing because it doesn't serve me anymore. And for others, it looks differently, right? Like, I reject these things, but this is what is serving me. And this is what I'm going to hold on to. And I think it's okay to live in whichever place you want to live in,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
It's okay to have your faith and know that abuse is not okay.
Right. Right.
And it's okay to not have that, to just say, hey, you know what, this doesn't work for me anymore.
Right.
And to move forward in a different direction.
Right.
And allowing people to choose, right?
Yep.
Which way they want to go with that.
Yeah.
And understanding that it can take years to recover from, right? It can take so long to come to a place where you have maybe a little bit more footing and security and surety within yourself of what is right for you.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's kind of like you were mentioning before, like when people are in a class and you're giving them autonomy in class, right? To kind of, I think it's the same thing, right? Because, just from people that I've known that might not have been like severe, like big T trauma in the sense of that a lot of people deal with in spiritual, religious realm, but like undoing this, like unconditioning, deconditioning all these pieces, like it's like reminding yourself that you do have autonomy. Like you're saying, like, I can choose to say this doesn't serve me anymore. Like I have agency in that. Like I can choose to say, I'm going to believe this, or I'm going to take this piece or whatever. Like you have autonomy in that. I think, and I'm sure that's really hard for people to learn. And again, it's that rewiring thing in their head. Like, wait, I do have a choice now. Like I can imagine that piece is pretty tough.
Yeah. Because most people are taught that it's one way.
Exactly. Right.
And whatever, pick a religion, right?
Right.
We're taught it's one way.
Right.
And it's not.
Yeah. No. Well, and I also like how you said it, and I read something you posted on social media. It might've been a long time ago, but you said it just a second ago about how there's a grieving process when you're healing from trauma. Because it is, especially like, even if we're not talking about spiritual abuse, even just like in a relationship, whatever, like you're having to grieve like that part of your life that's over, and like that person you used to be like there. I think that is a huge piece of what you have to work through, right? Is that grieving process.
Absolutely. And grief looks so different for everyone.
Right.
But, when we're recovering from trauma in general, any kind of relational trauma or even spiritual abuse, it's the grieving of the things that happened, right? The things that you had hoped for, right? The I wish it would have been this way, or that it could have been this way, or it should have been. And then a big part of the grieving process that I don't think that is talked about too much is the death of, right, like your old self, right? It was once you move forward in growth, it's really hard to move backwards and go back to old patterns.
Yeah.
Even if we might go backwards a little bit, or, take a step back, and that's just part of life. But that grieving process of, I'm having to completely change who I am now in order to be the healthier version of myself.
Totally.
Right. And that growth it can be very painful.
It's scary for people.
So scary because we don't know it, right? Like,
exactly.
If we've been in dysfunction for so long, it's easier.
That's what's familiar.
That's what's familiar. But when we're trying to change those neural pathways and make new changes, right, with anything in our life, particularly with trauma and changing relational patterns, right, that can be very challenging. And people tend to get very frustrated with themselves with the process because it feels like I'm not making any strides.
Right.
And my favorite thing to do in sessions with clients is, well, remember when you first came, and taking them back to the beginning.
Yes.
And reminding them of how they used to react to certain things. And then in that moment, they're like, oh yeah, I actually have grown.
Yep.
Right. And sometimes we need that person to remind us
Exactly.
that no, you're actually doing really great.
Right.
And don't beat yourself up.
Yeah.
And allow yourself to grieve as things come up.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so crucial in being able to what I was going to say is I think it's internal and external too, like judgment around that, right? Like, cause like you're saying, everybody grieves differently. Like I did not expect to take this conversation this direction, but what came to my head was talking about suicide. And if you're listening to this podcast, it's been a couple months now, but Twitch just a couple weeks ago, committed suicide. And so everybody's been talking about it. And I feel like there's so much judgment that comes up around this, and not even suicide, but even just like dealing with trauma. And well, why didn't you come forward sooner? And why didn't you deal with this sooner? Why didn't you get out this relationship sooner? And why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And we, it's so easy for us to judge somebody else and how they're dealing with that situation. But I think it goes back to, like you're saying, like you've literally created this neural pathways in your brain to know what's familiar and what's comfortable. And that's what your body like naturally goes to. And I think it's easy for us to judge like on the outside, but it's like, and I think even with suicide, like the rational mind doesn't understand that, where somebody's mind just goes to like, well, it's easier if I just end it. Like we can't rationalize that. But I just think that everybody's mind processes things so differently that it's, I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot more grace that can be had for people in dealing with their own mental health and their own mental health journey and all of that, because it just looks different for everybody, and everybody has to figure out how to navigate that in their own way, Yeah.
And kindness goes a long way,
Totally.
Kindness goes a long way, when it comes to suicide, and right. What you were saying of when people are in a situation for a really long time and there's all these questions of why didn't you, or you should have. There are things that are happening inside of the brain. Like our brain changes when we experience trauma. Right. And so there does have to be a lot of grace for that. And it's not an easy thing. If you are choosing to heal, if you're choosing to tend to your mental health, you have to know that it's not going to be a pretty journey, and it's messy. It's worth it, right? At the end, it's always worth it. But in the middle, there are a lot of feelings and emotions and things that start coming up that we don't want to deal with. And it starts to feel like it was easier for me to not bring all of this stuff up, because I've heard and I've experienced too, right? Like I feel even worse than I did before I came. Right. When you're in the middle of it and trying to resurface all of that stuff, as you continue to push through, right? Little by little. And it really is moment by moment, right? If you can just get through the next moment, you do come out the other side just with so much freedom, I think, and peace.
Yeah.
And we don't know what people's situations are, right? When it comes to abusive relationships, right? We don't know what that person, right? The victim is needing to stay safe from. So in their mind, they're probably thinking it's safer for me to stay in this than to try to leave. And so we have to show compassion to people who they know, right? They probably have come to an awareness of, this is not okay. And I need to get out. And how am I going to get out safely? Especially if there's children involved.
Right.
When it comes to suicide and suicidal ideation, right? It's that when we get to this point of complete hopelessness, that we don't think there's any other way but to exit.
Right.
And if you're listening to this, that you matter and your life matters, and it's temporary. Every moment that we're in, every season is temporary. We are never in the same place forever, right? And I think that's the hope, is that things might be difficult in the season that you're in right now, but there's a brighter day coming.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, I know like this is not exactly the same thing as talking about suicide, but I know when you have tiny babies and it's so hard at the beginning. And I know That's always some of the best advice, I feel like, is when people are like, literally take it 1 hour, one day at a time. Like if you look far ahead and you're like, oh my God, there's 3 more months of this. And, it's so hard. But if you're able to look at it like, okay, just I'm going to do today and then I'll do tomorrow, like doing it just one step at a time. And again, like you're saying, like knowing that it's just a season, like there's seasons of life and the season never lasts forever.
Yeah.
And I know I have to tell my clients a lot too. And, they're not well, some of them are dealing with trauma with a licensed professional, of course, not with me. But when we're dealing with, healing their body from chronic whatever, there is a bit, and I'm honest with them too, and that it always gets worse before it gets better. And, people like, I'm going to feel crappy for a little while because there's all these things stirring up in your body that we were like, now we have to heal it because we're bringing all these things to the surface, but now we can heal it now that we brought it to the surface. So I feel like, it's the same thing with mental health, right? It can feel worse before it gets better. And just with the awareness that it's just for a little while, like it's just to get to the other side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Switching gears a little bit, I do want to ask you, what drove you into this? Because I know there's a lot of directions you can go as a therapist. So what drove you into this particular lane, if you will?
Of trauma recovery and my body? Okay. So when I was in grad school, I knew that, right? So you're sitting in class, right? Anyone that's had to go to school for anything, you're sitting there like, there's got to be a different way. Like, is this all?
Totally.
And I remember just semester after semester, like, this is fascinating and I love what I'm learning. And also, I know that this is not like, there's more to this. And so, anyways, when it came time to do my internship and practicum and all that, right, towards the end of my program, I was looking for a site to do all of those things and stumbled across a transitional living home for teenagers who were aging out of the foster care system, right? Who had not been adopted and they were in the system for years. And that was my first encounter with trauma and how unsolved and unresolved trauma can really, how it manifests in others, right? And without there being adequate support. And I mean, talk about a place where there was so much of it, right? All the time. At the same time, my parents had brought in 3 young children who were in CPS care and later adopted them. And so I was living at home with my parents while these 3 children were coming in to our home at the same time. And then I was doing my internship with teenagers, right? And so I just saw in front of me, like, okay, there are these like little kids, right? Now siblings, and their trauma, my goodness. And then seeing kind of like if this is not helped and resolved, like this is what it turns into, and seeing these, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who were dealing with things. And then as I started to peel back and learn more about the history of my own family and the different traumas that great grandparents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, right, had experienced, it was just a no-brainer. Like I felt like during that time, I have to do something about this, even if it's in my tiny little corner of the world, in Texas. Like this is where I want to stay, and this is where I want to camp out and help people and do as much good as I can in this space. So that's where it started out.
I love it. It's like divine direction. Like that's, I love that. I love that. That's amazing. Well, and you are doing good work. Cause I mean, for y'all listening, I mean, even if you don't live in Texas, I mean, all you have to do is go to her Instagram page and get, all kinds of mental health support just from scrolling through her Instagram page. So you are doing good. Even if it is just your little space in Texas, I feel like it's more than you think. It's broader than you think for sure. So I do have one last question that I want to ask you that I like to ask everybody. But before I ask you that, can you let everybody know where the best place is to just learn more about you and everything that you're doing in the mental health space?
Yeah, I hang out on Instagram a lot. My therapy practice is Whole Life Healing _. And then the studio is the Mindful Collective Studio. Yeah.
Love it. All right. And of course, I have all the links to that in the show notes for y'all to check out. And definitely go give her a follow on Instagram and get all your mental health support there on her Instagram page. She does a great job there on Instagram. So, okay, the last question I want to ask you is, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
Love yourself enough to choose healing.
That's good. I love that. And I think that's, we talk about self-care, and I honestly hate that word now because it's so overplayed.
So used.
But it really is. And I still use it because I'm like, I don't know, what else do you call it?
What else do you use? Yeah.
Yes. But I love, because I think that's what it is. And, I say similar language or in my world and helping people, heal from chronic symptoms or diseases or whatever. But it's like choosing healing is the ultimate act of self-care. Like, I've had episodes talking about self-care before. We think self-care has to be like this frou-frou thing you do at the spa or whatever. But like self-care is just literally taking care of yourself. And the best way, I mean, it is like you're saying, and I think that's the ultimate act of self-care, is like choosing to heal, like choosing healing. Like I choose to heal myself. Like that's it.
On all fronts, right? Mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically.
Yep.
Yeah. Your whole personhood.
Yeah. Right. Because it's not just physical and it's not just mental, like it's all of it. Yeah. So I love that. That's such good advice. Thank you, Johanna. And thank you for sharing your insight and all of this, and for all of the work that you do in the mental health space. Like you're doing a world of good, and I am grateful for you and everything that you're helping everybody with. So thank you for sharing all that with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I love to know what you find useful in these episodes so I know how I can provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics that you want to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's @TheHopePedraza, or visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.